I'm going to share some stories with you, and I'm going to share some ideas with you. And one of the things that helps me get up in front of a bunch of strangers and do this is to say to you right from the beginning that I'm the one talking, but actually I am a representative of a whole bunch of other people. There's like a whole bunch of other people back where I'm from, and I'll be telling you some like personal details about myself, but in some ways, I don't know, where I come from, the common way people talk is they talk about people's lived experience. We have lived experience, and it's like a euphemism often for people like me who've been diagnosed with mental illness. So I have my personal lived experience, but then I think that there's also such a thing as collective lived experience. Everyone in this room today is having the collective lived experience of, you know, being at this conference together and learning from each other and meeting each other. So hopefully, you know, in the next few minutes as I'm talking, I'll say some things that are useful and interesting from mine and a more collective lived experience. So I think the best way to tell this story is to actually get really personal and start from this place that, you know, when I was a teenager, the first time that I got locked up in a psychiatric hospital, it was very dramatic. The police found me walking on the subway tracks in New York City, and I was convinced that the world was about to end and that I was being broadcast live on primetime television on all the channels, and that there was microscopic transmitters implanted under my skin that were recording my thoughts for like a top secret government agency. And I ended up having this experience that I'm imagining that there's like, you know, at least some people in the room have had, where the police, you know, as representatives of the order of the city, threw me to the ground and threw me in a jail cell, and then found my mother, who was really very terrified, you know, that she was getting this call from the police, and she signed some papers, and they got a court order to forcefully medicate me, and they, you know, threw me in a padded room. And I spent a good chunk of time as an 18-year-old, like in the psychiatric system. But the reason I tell you this story at the beginning is like, this is actually the kind of foundational story for me. Like, I ended up as a person who, you know, for whatever reason, like, there's a guy named John floating around here somewhere who has a podcast called Psychosis and Coffee. I don't know if anyone knows. You got that too? Yeah, all right, cool. I'm glad. Well, it's a good thing you're here. We'll talk about it. So what ended up happening was, due to like the luck of or whatever of like the good company that I was keeping, I managed to keep myself out of the psych ward. But I also found myself getting hospitalized a number of times after that. And when I was in my mid-20s, I ended up writing an article for a mainstream magazine that was about being diagnosed with bipolar disorder, because that was the diagnosis that they gave me. And in the article, I said, so like one of the things, and you're going to hear me repeat this a couple times in different ways, because I think it's actually like part of what I bring to the party, as it were. I have this experience that's different than a lot of people's experiences, which is that the psychiatric drugs that I've taken have actually been really helpful for me. And I actually take psychiatric drugs. I took them last night. I'll take them tonight. I've been doing it for a long time. And the thing was, it was very confusing for me, because for the people that I was keeping the company of, the kind of culture that I came from, I did not have then, nor do I have now, any trust of the pharmaceutical industry or the mainstream medical establishment at all. So the idea that these drugs were helping me was actually quite alienating. It was like it was hard to make sense of, because I would, you know, there was like the mainstream narrative, and then there was like what my friends were saying, and like the, I remember reading a book by a guy named Peter Breggin called "Your Drug May Be Your Problem," and it said, the drug I was taking, lithium, was a brain disabling agent. And I was like, I might as well just kill myself now, Like I might, like, if this seems to be helping me, but it's actually just like I'm actually just disabling my brain, like, what hope do I have? So, anyway, what ended up happening was, and like, here's a lesson, like this is like one of these like key lessons in my life, and I'm happy to be able to like impart it to you. Maybe you will find it useful. There is this thing where if you put yourself out there into the world and you tell, you say some stuff that's actually like personal, that would normally be like the kind of things that people don't say, oftentimes there's this impulse that there's other people who want to then tell you their story. That's just a thing. It's a human thing. In social psychological literature, they talk about mutual self-disclosure, and self-disclosure is like one of the key kind of fundamental ingredients of what makes human relationships. So anyway, I ended up writing this story. It got published. Thousands of people read it. My inbox was filled with emails from strangers, like long emails, people just telling me like, super detailed experiences about their lives. And one of those people was this person named Jax McNamara, who the night Jax and I met, we stayed up all night, just talking a mile a minute. And if there had been like a psychiatrist in the room taking notes, they would have said we were manic, because we were definitely, like exhibiting manic tendencies. And we came up with this idea to start a website called the Icarus Project. Just out of curiosity, how many people here have ever heard of the Icarus Project? Awesome, that's great, because we started on the other side of the world, and a bunch of you know what it is. So basically, when we started the project, what we said was, rather than seeing ourselves as diseased and disordered, we see ourselves as having dangerous gifts. So Icarus is the boy in Greek mythology who has wings, and he ends up flying too close to the sun. And basically what we were saying was that we had this double-edged blessing and curse. There was like this sensitivity, this thing that we had that a lot of other people don't have, that allowed us to be able to do things that other people can't do, if we could learn how to use them. And so, by the way, this is all a while ago. Like the story I'm telling you is like, this is like 2002. So 2002, me and Jack start the Icarus Project. It becomes this website. We end up having, we end up becoming this kind of magnet for brilliant, kind of crazy people. And within the course of a year, there's like 1,000 people posting on our forums. We ended up making this book called Navigating the Space Between Brilliance and Madness. And in the midst of it, we had all these really interesting conversations that were coming up, like all these people talking to each other. Also, keep in mind, this is like some years before social media, so this is before the kind of age of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So we're writing on discussion forums. And the discussions forums we're writing on, they have names like alternate dimensions or psychotic delusions, and so people are like writing down, these stories about the things that they've been through. Yeah, I thought I was Jesus, and I thought that I was like, there to save the world, and then all of a sudden I was locked up. And then someone else is like, yeah, me too, the same thing happened, and then there's like, there's this incredible power when you get a bunch of people together to start sharing stories, because what you start doing is creating culture. In many ways, like when we wrote this book, which we sold out 10 printings of it, and you can find it for free, by the way. If you just like look online, you'll find a PDF of it. Our vision was we were trying to create an alternative language and culture for what gets called mental health and mental illness. That's how we were talking. We were like, there's like a mainstream view, there's like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. They got some language about people like us, but we're creating a new culture. And I think early on, there were these things that came up. These, like how serious were we going to take this language they're using anyway? At the beginning we used this language of bipolar, but then pretty quickly all these other people started finding us who had all kinds of other labels or didn't even have labels or whatever, and resonated, like it resonated with them. They were like finding the language and it was working. So we actually dropped the bipolar language after a little while. And actually, interestingly enough, in retrospect, so like looking back like 10 plus years, it became really clear that we started our project right around the same time that a number of antipsychotic drugs ended up got official, in the US, I'm not sure what it was like over here, could suddenly be prescribed for people with bipolar disorder. And so suddenly this like enormous, drastic increase in the rise of bipolar diagnoses. And as John was saying earlier, I mean, really when it comes down to it, so much of what gets called mental health and mental illness has to do with the traumas that we experienced when we were young. And I personally believe that, like if I could just speak from myself, I do think that there's something, I think I was born sensitive. Everything that I hear from the way that I hear the stories, I was a really intense kid. I was also in an intense environment or whatever, but I think, I do think that there's this mix of, I think some people are born more sensitive, and but we'll get to that. This story keeps going. I just, like I said, everything I'm talking about happened more than a decade ago. So the thing with the Icarus Project is that it just kept growing and getting more interesting, and we ended up, eventually, we partnered. I found out that there is, so in New York City, there's a place called Fountain House, and it's the original mental health clubhouse, and they have like an international network of clubhouses. But the people at Fountain House gave us an office space, and we got this grant to organize on college campuses, and so Icarus was growing, and we made this little booklet called Friends Make the Best Medicine, a guide to creating community mental health support networks. And the idea was, let's give people tools and resources to start peer-based mental health support groups, to start groups for other people who had struggled with similar things, to get together and support each other and build mutual aid. And I left this out of the story, but I feel like it's probably relevant to mention that I came of age in New York City. Like I was a teenager in the late 1980s and early 90s when there was actually a large social movement that people had taken over abandoned buildings and squatted them and were living in them. And there was I spent my teenage years hanging out with anarchists and punks. If you want to understand me and why the way I turned out the way I did, and like the Icarus Project and like its cultural ideological roots, that would be a good place to look. And with this understanding that, the society that we live in is fucking crazy. Like that's just like, let's start there. Like if we're going to do any kind of mental health assessments of any other people and the things that they're going through, fine. But like let's start from the place that the daily life, the social conceptions, the way that we're raised. There's fundamental things that are like, I would use the word psychotic to talk about them, and I feel confident getting up on a stage in front of people and saying it. So that's one. And two, that people fundamentally have the ability to support each other, and that we can actually provide support and space, and that actually people who've been through things often are way better at providing support to other people who've also been through those things. So that's like a fundamental, that's a starting place. And so in the Icarus Project, what we did was we tried our best to create a culture where when we were talking about mental health, we were talking about it in this larger social context of, yeah, the society that we live in is crazy, and B, we can take care of each other. Something like that. Are y'all following me so far? Is that, yeah? Okay, good. Good. It's been a cultural adjustment for me to like come here and be like, I like, at this point I'm like, yeah, they seem like I can't tell they're not speaking, but it's, oh, I'm in the UK. Okay. So one of the things that we did at the Icarus Project that I think was one of like the more important pieces was we published this book called The Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off of Psychiatric Drugs. And the reason we published a book called The Harm Reduction Guide to Coming Off of Psychiatric Drugs is that there is an incredible amount of information out there about going on psychiatric drugs, like a ton, especially where I live. It's like actually like way more dramatic and fucked up. Like you turn on the television where I live and there's like ads for antipsychotic drugs. There's like an Abilify ad and you're like, what the hell? Like, you know, and they don't even say what it is, but there's like a woman chasing a dog or, you know, whatever. And they're but there's like, you know, as John was talking about earlier, there's actually so little information about coming off, and so what we did was we found the best information out there that we could, and we compiled it into a guide, and it's been translated into 12 languages, I believe, so far. But fundamentally, the idea was, you know, there's so much of what psych drugs end up doing is if they're working, I mean, if they're like, you know, if they're doing their job, is to kind of hold you together and keep you together in a world that's actually like really hard to live in. And I mean, that's how I think about my relationship to drugs. Like, I don't believe for a second, I mean, and it's good to know I'm keeping similar company here today. Like, there's this language of the chemical imbalance, that we have chemicals imbalanced in our brain. And so according to, you know, according to the way the story, the mainstream story gets told, I'm someone with a serious mental illness called, my diagnosis is bipolar 1 with psychotic features. I have a chemical imbalance in my brain, and I take drugs to like balance out the chemicals in my brain. And yeah, that's a story, you know, there's not any scientific evidence to prove it, but it's a story. Lots of people believe that story. I personally have a different story that works really well for me, and this will give you a sense of just where I'm coming from. And I'm saying this to you that like, it may sound humorous, but I'm actually dead fucking serious. Like, I actually believe that I have superpowers, and I take drugs to control my superpowers, okay? So that's like, and that's the place that I'm coming from, and that's what actually, like, makes sense to me. And at some point, it would be nice to be able to actually be in a place and have it together to kind of not take the drugs, but as long as I'm doing it, I don't know. I mean, let's just be realistic about it. So I think, I guess I'm telling you about the Harm Reduction Guide because I just want you to understand. If you didn't know that the resource is out there, it's out there. But I also want you to just understand the place that we were coming from, like as a group of people. Because for me, as I've been traveling around, oh, and I'll stop this for a second and just say, I'm going to get to this, but for the last month, I've been going around and giving talks like this. But I haven't been doing a whole lot of talks like this in recent years because I've actually been working in the public mental health system. And so it's been fun to talk because I hope you're enjoying yourself. I'm enjoying myself as I'm talking to you. But the ability to like kind of impart, like I'm going to say a whole bunch of things to you. In all likelihood, you're going to forget most of it. But that's really okay. But what I would ask is that you try and hold on to a few fundamental things. So I'm gonna tell you one of those things because this is something that I've learned that I think is worth passing on to you all. If you're interested in getting together with groups of people and having conversations about mental health, about each other's mental health, and about the larger role, you know, that you play in the world and the society, it can be really, really helpful to start from the place that if you take psychiatric drugs or if you don't take psychiatric drugs, you're welcome to be a part of the conversation. And what I mean by that is if you take psychiatric drugs and you find them helpful, or you think they're poisonous fucking garbage and you would never put them in your body, you're welcome to be a part of the conversation. And and so there you go. There's like one piece like that. This is something I've gleaned from years of you know, doing this work. Here, I'll tell you another one. If you use diagnostic categories to define yourself, like schizophrenia or bipolar or clinically depressed, or you think all those categories are nonsense, you're welcome to be a part of the conversations that we're having. So that's like, seems like a little thing, but if you can hold it, if you can make space for the fact that like people are going to have really different ideas about things sometimes, and that you can be like, this is how I feel real strongly about it. Oh, you feel differently about it. Okay. That saves an incredible amount of time, and energy. And the last one, and then I'll keep going. And this is still under the category of things I think you should remember, even if you forget everything else I'm saying. In a room like this, in a room this size, there's going to be a large variation of relationships we have to our family. Like some people have really like close relationships with their families. And then some people want nothing to do with their families. And like, that's okay. Like, that's all right. But like recognizing that like we have a bunch of different ways of thinking about it and looking at it because of the life experiences that we've had. And I feel like I was talking to John about this a few minutes ago, but there's this way that trauma, it's like, I think it's a really common thing that, for any of us, for anyone in this room, because we've all experienced trauma in different ways, it can make us sometimes think in black and white. And the ability to be able to just like hold complexity, that's something that comes with, I don't know, like sometimes you have to work at it. It's something that happens in groups, and you know, but anyway, those are things that I would suggest. You know, if that's if what you're interested in is getting together with groups of people, which is something I'm interested in. Okay, so just on the drug thing, we were like, so I mean, I think it's really important that so this is Kanye West, he's very popular in the country that I come from. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of him over here. But you know, recently he was diagnosed bipolar, and then he went off his drugs. And anyway, there was like this slew of articles that came out, and this article actually was, you know, it was quoting a number of psychiatrists at the institute where I was working. But I think that like when we talk about trauma and we talk about polarization, there's this way that we can get incredibly polarized. You just see it. Just look at the newspaper headlines. Just look. We're experiencing such intense trauma on a daily basis, and so I think it's just for those of us who care about these conversations and having them, being able to have the complexity and like, you know, and not just constantly just be like, oh, that's really stupid, that's really, you know. So on one hand, we have Kanye West, who's just like, you know, I'm like a superhero, and you know, and then on the other hand, we have like, it's really problematic that he's not taking these drugs, and, you know, and then what I'm saying is we need to have a lot of, we need to have, you know, the conversations in between. And so that's pretty much what we tried to do with the Icarus Project, you know, and I guess there's a couple slides here that are just, to give you a sense of what we were doing. Like over a period of time, we tried to like create spaces where there was like, we used this language of, you know, madness and mad gifts, and we said things like, actually, I'll read this to you. It's very small. Sometimes I make it a lot bigger, but this is a great example. This is a quote from someone on the Icarus Project website. Then somebody else made a poster of it. But you know, it said sometimes wanting to kill yourself just means you don't want to live the life that you're living. But you know what? You can change your life with that power. Where you were about to lose your whole life. Maybe instead you can lose your school or job or pretenses or fears, adherences to society standards or shame. Some of my suicidal episodes have been strangely liberating in that way. I wouldn't take back any of what made me who I am today. Anyway, I read that because, at least in my country, there's a lot of there's a lot of language around suicide prevention, and simultaneously there's a lot of language around stigma reduction of mental illness, and I think in some ways, I hope it's coming across that what me and my friends have been doing for the past bunch of years is just trying to push things in like a further direction. So because like there's like all this, you know, I think it's having conversations about what, you know, about not wanting to, you know, about trying to prevent suicide and reducing the stigma of mental illness often leave out a lot of social context about like why it is people are suicidal and what it is that's going on. And I would say this would be a good point to say, this would be a good point in my talk to say it. There's, in my country, there's like a ton of anti-stigma campaign stuff that happens. It seems like there's some stuff like that here too, right? There's like anti-stigma, like, you know, reducing the stigma of people with mental illness, which, you know, I mean, I think could be a really positive thing, except for a couple reasons that it's actually like it's hard for people like me to stomach. One, where I come from, at least, the language of stigma has no legal ramifications at all. You know, if you want to talk about discrimination and like discriminating against someone, there's some legal ramifications for that. But just stigmatizing someone, that's like like there's nothing there. Two, those campaigns are almost entirely funded by pharmaceutical companies, which, if you stop and think about it, have a lot to benefit from people talking about, you know, not being stigmatized to talk about mental illness. I mean, I think in a lot of ways. And John said it before, I heard him say it when he was up here as well, this like, it's hard to stop talking about mental illness, but it's almost like putting it in brackets, putting it in quotation marks, I think can be really helpful. Because if what the goal is to reduce, you know, stigma of mental illness, but you're like talking about mental illness, then like, what are you doing? Anyway, what are you doing? So I'm actually, a number of what I got to do while I was traveling around the UK was I got to lead these workshops, these TMAPS workshops, and TMAPS came out of a place around more than a decade ago. Well, there's a woman in Vermont, you know, back in my home country. There's a woman named Mary Ellen Copeland who developed something called WRAP, Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And the basic idea was getting together with other people and writing down what are the things you need to know in the event that you're having a hard time, that you can share with people. And she developed these WRAP plans. And then in my community, the Icarus Project, which was a little more kind of countercultural and like not as trusting of the kind of mainstream system of talking about wellness and recovery, people started calling them mad maps, but basically making these mad maps. And maybe some of you have seen, if you're familiar with the Icarus Project now, they do mad maps workshops. So what I've been doing is something really similar, and it's this idea of basically getting rooms full of people together and having conversations about what does it look like when we're doing well, and what does it look like individually, and then what does it look like when we're doing well as a community. And then what does it look like when we're not doing well? And then what are the things that we need to do to be taking better care of each other? And then who are the people that we think are important to be having these conversations with? And, you know, I guess if I was just going to like sum up, because since this is not a TMAPS workshop, but like a one slide where I'm just summing it up, I would say that it's, the idea is really that so much of what we call mental health and mental illness actually has to do with communication. It has to do with our own ability to understand ourselves and what's going on, and then to be able to have those conversations with other people. And so there's a lot of tools out there to do stuff like this. And so, yeah, we'll return to this in a moment. Okay, so this is where we get to, this is just a couple years ago. So, so if you look at this photograph, you're going to see three people. So one of them's me, and then Peter Kinderman and Ann Cook. And they were visiting from the UK, and they came to New York City. This is at like a radical bookstore in Manhattan called Blue Stockings. And we were having a New York City Icarus Project meeting. And they came to present on this document that they made called Understanding Psychosis and Schizophrenia. Are people familiar with this? Yeah? Head nods? Yes? Some? Okay. But because I'm asking because it's actually like, it plays into, it ended up, sometimes in life, you know, you're going along and then like people just end up crossing your path, and then they end up, it ends up having like a bigger influence on you than you might think. Anyway, Ann and Peter came, they were presenting, they were in New York City, and the week that they were visiting and presenting this new book of theirs, which, by the way, it's like a really, you know, it's a good, it's been a very useful manual for me because it was published by the British Psychological Society, which sounds really official, so I can say like, hey, the British Psychological Society says you're full of shit, or whatever. But, so this article came out in the New York Times, which is the New York Times is like, it's like a well-respected newspaper where I live. And the article was about this book that they had put out. And it was a very positive, it was a positive article. And the next thing that happened was that this guy right here, so this man right here, his name is Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, and he is head of the New York State Psychiatric Institute in New York City. He came out and he was like, he's the kind of psychiatrist that wears a white lab coat, because he's like, what he's trying to say is like, we're doctors, you know, we're medical doctors. But he's the former head of the American Psychiatric Association, and he's, you know, like he responded. He tried to get a further article in the New York Times, but they wouldn't publish it. But he made a video, and this is actually like a little screenshot of the video. And then he said, this article about mental illness was incredibly unscholarly, misinformed, confused, at worst unhelpful, and at best destructive. And he was like, you are insulting psychiatry as a discipline by putting out this book, because basically the book is saying, yeah, you know, there's no medical evidence that schizophrenia like exists as a disease, but we have a pretty good sense of what we think it, you know, when we're talking about schizophrenia, what that means. Anyway, that's what Jeffrey Lieberman had to say. Okay, so this is the point, and I'm really, once again, I just want you all to know I'm really enjoying myself up here. Like, I'm having a good time. Like, in some ways, this is kind of like therapy for me. Like, I'm like, because the next thing that happened was that I got hired at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Like, that's right, I did. The thing I didn't tell you is that after the Icarus Project, I went and got a master's in social work. And then I was working, there's some people here who are familiar with open dialogue. There was a pilot project in New York City called Parachute, and I was a clinical intern on a parachute team where there was, the team was made up of half clinicians and then half peer specialists. And then I was the clinical intern on the team. And, you know, the peer specialists, I think probably all of you know, are people who work in the mental health system but have been diagnosed with a mental illness themselves. And so have a kind of different perspective than a clinician. And so in my clinical internship, I got really interested in peer specialists because, I basically got hired. I was like doing this internship, and then I was like, wait, am I a clinician? Am I a peer? What am I? I can't figure it out. I'll write a paper about it. So I wrote this 68-page research paper about the working relationships between peers and clinicians on mental health teams. And then I got hired at the Center for Practice Innovations, which is the research and training body of the Office of Mental Health of the state of New York. And they hired me to design a training program for peer specialists working on first episode psychosis programs. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 3 years. And it's been awesome, but it's also been just fucking totally exhausting. Like just totally, just like incredibly, like gut-wrenchingly, painfully hard to be a person like me working in that environment. And so, so I quit my job a month ago, and I came here. And so basically, that's just so you know, that's where we are in the story. We're in the story. And so what I'm going to do right now with the rest of my time, how much time do I have?
15, 20 minutes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a little bit about, I'm basically going to do some of the training like that I developed. And when I say I don't actually mean I, because like there's no way I would have been able to do it on my own. There was I got a lot of help from people in my community. Training that I did for peer specialists and then also for the supervisors of peer specialists. And so, let's see. So, I'll just jump right into it, okay? So all the slides that you're going to see now, except the ones right at the end, are slides that I actually used in training and that I spent over the past bunch of years. So one of the things, and because I think I said what I was going to talk about was like peer support and psychosis or whatever. So imagine I'm working on a first episode psychosis team. People are getting hired as peer workers. The first thing you need to know when you're working as a peer is that the peer, your job didn't start in the mental health system. If you're working as a peer, your job exists because there were people who fought really hard to make sure that there were people like us who could have jobs in the system. And then where I come from, there's like a direct lineage from the Black freedom movement, from the civil rights movement in the 1960s, from women's liberation movements, from gay and lesbian pride movements, from disability rights movements, from people in those movements and people who were part of creating organizations like the Mental Patients Liberation Front and all the groups that were the precursors came out of these movements because it was a different period of history, and we need to understand our history to understand how it is that we got here. So I mean, the peer role originated in consumer ex-patient movements in the 70s with the aim of reforming the mental health system. It was adopted as a professional role in the mental health system after lots of organizing and advocacy. There's been a large growth in the workforce in recent years with the rise of the recovery movement, and the struggle continues for respect and clarity of role in the workplace. That last point right there, the struggle continues for respect and clarity of role in the workplace. I mean, I'm assuming that there's a number of people in this room who have either worked in peer roles or work in the system or have are in that arena. But there's this incredible, where I'm from, and as I've come to learn, as I've traveled around, it seems pretty similar here, there's an incredible amount of disrespect for people who are working in peer roles in the system, people who are getting paid way less than everyone around them. Oftentimes people end up doing very similar jobs to what other people in case manager roles or clinical roles. And this idea of what it means to actually be a peer seems less about peer support, which is about mutuality, which is about people connecting people like us who get diagnosed with serious mental illness end up getting an incredible amount of disrespect. Like people like look down on us. People think that we're subhuman, that we like don't, that we can't do other like things that other people can do. When the reality is that there's all these things that we actually can do that other people can't do. And so part of my job was to try and figure out how to work in a system that played a lot of lip service to like, oh, the voices of peers, but didn't actually, when it came down to it, it wasn't really taken seriously. Okay, so, some of the things that I think are really important, as you've heard me say a couple times already, is just how important it is to know that you're part of a larger movement and that there's other people out there that are having important conversations, and that if you find yourself in a peer role in the mental health system, that what that means is you are part of something larger than yourself, and that having that that relationship, that there's no such thing as an individual peer. Like it's a relational word, peer. It's a word that means there are other peers, and so yeah, these are just some examples of peer stuff happening where I live. And what I was saying a minute ago about TMAPs and transformative mutual aid practices, I got to train a whole bunch of peer workers in that model, except I didn't call it that. It was called on-track maps, or ACT maps, depending on where I was working. And I would basically have this opportunity to get together with people and just ask, if any of you were at like workshops I did over the last month, my favorite thing to do is to get a room of people together and like ask big questions like this, see what happens. But yeah. So okay, so I'm gonna show. I'm gonna do this quickly, but I feel like, and I'll probably skip over a couple of these because I think I just want you to. I want you to get the sense of what we were trying to do, because at the heart of it, it was this. I came into a system where there was clinicians, and they had a role, and then there was peers hired, and it was not so clear what their role was. And it was like my job to clarify it. And so the first example is this. So this is really straightforward. So peer clinical distinctions. Okay, so peers are required to have experienced life-interrupting distress of some sort, typically involving psychiatric diagnosis and a history of receiving psychiatric services. Whereas, while some clinicians may have similar life experience, it's not required by design of the role. And then in this Venn diagram, the center is like the overlap, obviously. Growing system understanding, regardless of role, of the importance of personal experience when supporting others. But then, I wanted to make sure that this stuff was clear, because this stuff is often not very clear. So people working in peer roles have a vested, and we're talking about systemic discrimination here. People in peer roles have a vested interest in the impact of discrimination, prejudice, lack of choice, and force on individuals in the psychiatric system, and are further expected to use their stories and other tools to help raise consciousness of these issues among coworkers. Where, in contrast, while some clinicians may have similar experiences, awareness of these issues is not a basic job requirement, and in fact, it is often a struggle to fully understand impact if one has not had personal experience of this nature. So, remember right at the beginning when I talked about lived experience and my own lived experience, but then there's also such a thing as collective lived experience or group lived experience? I think the way that I have come to understand this, like being able to do this work, is that, not everybody who is working in a peer role has had the experience of being held down and shot up with Haldol, but just because they haven't, they're part of a larger movement of all kinds of people with all kinds of different experiences, and understanding the impact of force and coercion on people, and being part of a movements of solidarity. That's that, to my understanding of the peer role, and not everyone's is the same. That's like a basic job requirement. That part's really important. If we lose that, we're losing this key element. And Okay, this is another one. This is, I actually think this is, when we talk about peer work, I would love it. I hope this is a little seed that lands with some of you out there, because I think this is important. So this is language that comes straight out of social psychology. So here, I'll read it. We're talking about reciprocity. Reciprocity. Peers build bidirectional, reciprocal relationships with participants where they both provide and receive things like help, support, guidance, and feedback. The focus is on learning together. In contrast, clinicians build a mostly unidirectional relationship with participants with the goal of providing, but usually not receiving, help, support, guidance, or feedback. The focus is on professional instruction. For both peers and clinicians, collaborative efforts are generally seen as more functional than efforts that are one-sided. So I think that it's really useful. So for those of you who are in the peer realm, I think often what happens in the mental health system is that because it's a very, so I don't know if you like this, but I find this language really helpful, this language of unidirectional support. I am supporting you. I am supporting you. That's unidirectional support. Bidirectional support is we are supporting each other. My understanding of what it means to be a peer is that we're supporting each other. There's a you know, and I think that there's a set of skills that you can learn. I think some people like naturally are, you know, better at it. But I think that I think often in clinical training, people lose that like there's so many boundaries that end up going up that it's hard to actually to think about relationships as reciprocal. In fact, it's like considered like unprofessional. But I'll tell you, as someone who's spent a bunch of time in the psychiatric system, you know, who has seen a lot of people come in and out of the psychiatric system, there's this thing that often happens, whereas you're in a role where people are supposed to help you, and there's often very little opportunity to give back. There's very little opportunity to be giving back. And I think that the idea, if we're going to talk about peer support in the mental health system, we have to be actually talking about this. And I think we can actually do things like measure it. I think that there's actually ways. And I think, at least from what I've seen from in the peer world, there's such a lack of, it's not taken seriously. But I think it's actually quite a serious thing. People supporting each other and figuring out how it can happen. 5 minutes? Okay. Okay. Well, I'm just. Okay. I'll end on this one with the breakdowns, because and I'm not, and you know what, I'm going to read you the slide, and I'm going to tell you that it's not like I don't think this is the be all and end all. I think this is like where I landed. It could probably be better. But to give you a sense, I mean, okay, so let me just say, so what you call early intervention here, like in my country, they call first episode psychosis programs. And so I was working at what was like the most well-respected premier first episode psychosis program in the country, the one that we were like doing, we were training in New York State, but then also I was like, we had contracts with a bunch of other states. So I was like on the phone with all these people all the time. And it, like, and I think there's a way that, for me, there was like an excitement when I started the job where I was just like, oh my God, we get to actually like influence these young people's lives, have an opportunity to be able to get them like right when they're first coming into the system. And I think over time, there's a woman named Nev Jones, so I'm assuming there's some people here who know her, but Nev has ended up becoming a good friend. And she was someone who was in one of these first episode psychosis programs, and then she went and got a PhD in clinical psychology, and she's a researcher, and she's been my guide in many ways. She's been one of my guides through this world, and she told me at some point, you know, these first episode psychosis programs, these early intervention programs, were really started by researchers wanting to test drugs on young people. Like, that's where they started, you know? So, like, if we start from that place, it's really hard. Like, whatever, like, wherever you start, you can try and get away from it. You can try and grow, but it was very challenging. So, for me, like, for you, you know, and I mean, I feel John articulated it really well earlier, and I mean, I've looked out all the books out on the table out there. It's like we're in common company here. It's like the way we think about what we call psychosis. It has I think the key is that there's like lots of, in the same way that, you know, whether you take the drugs or you don't take the drugs, whatever, you know, there's lots of different ways to approach things. And I think that that's super critical. So, you know, in this version, what I got to bring into these first episode psychosis teams was this idea of multiple frameworks for thinking about psychosis, right? So people in the peer role focus on the many ways to understand the experience of psychosis: biopsychosocial, spiritual, cultural, psychosis as teacher, psychosis as a natural variation of human experience, etc. And then on the clinical side, the biopsychosocial approach is the main framework for diagnosis and treatment while utilizing a cultural competency framework. Now, obviously, what we would really want is, you know, we'd want a team where there's lots of different ways of thinking about psychosis. But it really is the job. I mean, I literally, here, let me find it. So, like, you know, I would sit at a desk doing my training, and then the woman who was training in the desk next to me, she was the one training all the outreach and recruitment people for all the teams, and she would sit there quoting the DSM-5 and the, you know, non-affective psychotic disorder, because the only people who would get accepted to this program were the ones diagnosed with non-affective psychotic disorder, not affective psychotic disorder, not drug-induced psychosis, not trauma, not PTSD, you know. And in many ways, the reason why I left that job, as much of an amazing experience as it was that I felt like, oh my God, even though I grew to like the people that I worked with, but I was just like, man, we are just playing into the hands of, I'd go back to the slide with Jeffrey Lieberman, but I feel like this understanding that basically what we're saying is that psychosis is a biological illness. It's not trauma. It's not, you know, and you know, and that's not what I'm interested in. But that's what the system is interested in perpetuating. And so sometimes you get into an interesting position like me, where you get like to find yourself, you know, kind of navigating those worlds. But this is what I ended up doing, was like doing trainings for peer workers, where I was like, okay, we're going to have conversations, you know, where we talk about all these different ways of thinking of psychosis. And I'll say this, and I know I'm like almost out of time here. Where I worked, there was a woman. One of my mentors was a woman named Pat Deegan, who she was someone also like Nev, who was diagnosed schizophrenic when she was a teenager, and then, in her words, she recovered from schizophrenia, went on to get a PhD in clinical psychology. And if you read any if you like reading academic journal articles, you know, if you read any journal articles about the mental health recovery movement, you will see a citation, Deegan 1988, and because she's the one who pretty much started using that word recovery back in the day. And I think that I'm like, really, I just don't like the word. I just don't like it. I mean, I know it can be really helpful for some. I'm just saying personally, like, I find that it's a word that, at least where I was working, oftentimes the word recovery had the word illness like embedded in it. So you'd get handed recovery, and what you were getting handed was a story about how you were ill, and maybe you recovered, or whatever that means. But it was like it was its own way. Anyway, so that's the point of that. I mean, I think that in the end, I'm really interested. I like this language of dangerous gifts. that's my, like, some people get freaked out by this, word, because they're like, whoa, how can you talk about, like, people with mental illness and being dangerous? That's really, that's not cool. You're not supposed to do that. But I actually think that in many ways, because the narrative is so pushed over to this other side of, it's so, like, absurd that we're like, it's 2019 and we're talking about, like, reducing the stigma of mental illness. Like, fuck you. I'm just like not interested. I'm like, I want to talk about superpowers. I want to talk about, like, there's like a ton of these shows on TV that are like about people who were traumatized and then found, like, gifts in their trauma, and they were sensitive. And how do we change that? And I will. I'm not sure what's going on here, but I will just end with this quote from a civil rights leader in the United States, Martin Luther King. He said a lot of really super brilliant things, and that are very quotable. But this is one of his lesser known quotes. He talked on a number of occasions about how human salvation lies in the hands of the creatively maladjusted. And my understanding of that quote is that it's not the normal people that are going to end up saving us. It's the people who don't fit in. And I think that we need to, like, own that and not try and not try and just fit into a really sick society. Okay, so I think that's all I got for you all, though I could talk for hours, but thank you very much, and yeah, there you go. Also, last thing, just last plug, especially if this is still being recorded, you should go to the Institute for the Development of Human Arts website, because that is the radical training institute we have in New York City. So it's idha-nyc.org. Okay.